as well, or did you?
No, just for advanced, just for stenography school at Fort Benjamin Harrison.
And where's that?
That's in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay. And were you drafted or did you enlist?
Drafted.
You were drafted.
Yes.
When and how did you find out that you were drafted?
When they sent me messages in the mail to when to report.
Okay. And where were you living at the time?
In West Hartford.
In West Hartford, Connecticut. Did you grow up in West Hartford?
Hartford and West Hartford.
West Hartford. And did you have any choice in terms of any aspect of the service, what branch or where or?
No, because the Army took the draftees, I believe.
Okay. All right. What were your first days in the service like, or even backing up, what was it like to get that notice, and what did it do to your?
Good. It wasn't a good one. Wasn't a good feeling. I mean, nobody, back then, everyone was dodging the draft. So if you didn't go to graduate school, certain graduate schools, or going to teaching, you were stuck. There was no real way to avoid it. And so I got lucky. My friends were teaching or in law school.
Did you have any other friends who were also?
Actually, or enlisted in the reserves. No, actually, my friends from high school and friends got into the Reserve or National Guard or went into education and were granted deferments for teaching. You had to teach, I believe, in an inner city or inner city school system, actually, but they would give you a deferment.
Did you give any thought to doing ahead of getting the notice, taking a different route?
Like enlisting? No.
Well, not if not
going to Canada. No.
or going into teaching or going to grad school.
No. No, because I wasn't going to go. I would have gone to grad school, but they wouldn't have allowed it. So I wasn't. No. I mean, I knew I wasn't going to teach, so I tried the reserves awful hard, but I missed. So anyway, that's my story.
Okay. What were your initial days like? Take us from the time you stepped into the service, and what were those first few days like?
Man, your time is, you go to the physical, you hop the bus, and you're at Fort Dix. And from then on, it's sort of a whirlwind. They've got every minute and every second planned for you. So at that time, basic was 8 weeks. I believe it's now 10, even in the Army. I'm not positive, but I believe it's longer. And much different than what my generation went through it. And you really don't really have time to feel sorry for yourself, because you find other people in your same boat. It was a highly educated Army, and that was true. It seemed as if you were either out of high school and got nailed, or you were a college graduate and you got nailed. It was one or the other. There sort of was not an in between. And there were guys in the Reserve and National Guard going through basic. But predominantly 80% were either draftees or kids who had enlisted. So, but it really, basic's not a lot of fun, but you were kept so busy. They really, up at 4:30 or 5, everything was planned, and you really had no time to, wallow in the mire, so to speak, because A, you were very busy, and B, you met, kids who were in the same, position as you were, and you didn't feel like I'm the only kid that got drafted. Hey, so-and-so's here, and he went to college, and so-and-so's here, and he went to college, and so forth and so on. That's and then it went, to be honest, the 8 weeks seemed to fly by because you were, it went fast because you were you're busy every minute of the day. But unfortunately at Fort Dix, which was one of the nicer forts to go through basic compared to Leonard Wood or Fort Polk, certainly it wasn't, it was a fairly moderate basic. It wasn't, by far, it means not the worst place to go through basic, one of the better places to go through basic. In fact, my drill sergeant was a college graduate and drafted. So
talk about
the rest of the drill sergeants were pretty dumb.
Talk about your instructors. Talk about that training experience. What they had.
My drill sergeant, his name was Johnson, and he was drafted. I remember, and we were his last cycle before he was getting discharged. There were other drill sergeants. Basically, their IQ was probably a little lower than their body temperature. They were not. I hate, they were not the greatest. I mean, the most intelligent people. It's not their job, and they hated. They did not like draftees. They preferred guys that enlisted in the Army.
How was that manifested? How was that?
I don't know if it was really manifested, but I remember they'd ask if you were, drafted. If you had a U.S. before your Social Security number, that was your official identification. You were drafted. If you were an enlisted, you had an RA, regular Army. And if you were National Guard, it was NG. If you were reservist, it was RA, not RA, something. So they kidded around about that because they were all enlisted. I mean, they had all enlisted, and they were career guys. So they'd dump on you, but that's part of training. I'm not sure they were really enamored with college graduates because probably most of them were not, and they were probably. I always felt probably jealous, and that's they made your life miserable, but they were frankly, but some of them, not all, but they, that's just the way it was. So,
among the guys you were with, was there a mix of enlisted and drafted, and what was that? How were they with one another?
They got along. I had a kid bunked with a kid, Alan Millstone, who was Yale grad. His father was a professor of medicine at Yale. And he actually wound up in the Army band, I believe. He was in the Yale band. And I remember telling him when they asked for tryouts. And I said, "You're crazy if you don't try out." And he did. And he looked about the furthest thing from a soldier as you could imagine. But all I know is he wound up in Army band, and I believe his first duty station was actually in the United States. I don't know whether he went overseas or not. We had a band in July. It's the march every Saturday morning. So it was really, it was quite a variety of, it was really.
Did the soldiers distinguish between enlisted and draftee, or did they really?
Not really. No, not really. I don't think so.
So, how did you get through that? How did you get through that experience?
It was. You got through it because misery loves company, and it's true. I guess it's sort of like being in prison. You can either do it or you can't, but you get, you didn't have time to think about your friends who were back home, and living a normal life because you were so damn busy. And then you were worried about what MOS you were going to get when you graduated out of basic.
And MOS means?
Military occupational specialty, or where your job is going to be. So that was always, in your mind, because no one wanted to get in the infantry or artillery. But I'm assuming that 80% of the draftees certainly wound up there. But really, it went so fast, and you were just so, all the things you had to learn, that it sort of went in a finger snap.
Did you have a sense that there was any way that you could influence what that job would be?
No, I don't think.
Assigned?
No, well, they give you a battery of tests at the beginning, written tests, and I remember I scored very high in the clerical, administrative, and pretty low in infantry. Those tests were easily rigged because they were sort of like the Cruder test that I took in high school that showed what you might be interested in later in life, forest ranger or CPA. But you could sort of rig those. And, you got your scores back. And I remember guys like 140 something on clerical and I don't know, 80 something or the most 90 on infantry, which was pretty low. And, but no, other than that, I don't think you had any influence. I mean, I'm sure your name went in a computer and your background and your education and whatever, and some of these scores, when all came out and it spit out in the end what was going to happen to you based on the needs of the Army at the time. I don't know how factual that is, but that's how I always felt.
So after boot camp, where did you go? Where were you?
I went to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis.
And how long were you there?
4 months. It extended 4.5 months.
And at that point, did you know what you'd be asked?
Yeah, after boot camp, you know what you're going to do. So we thought, when we got our MOS, which was stenographer, we thought we were going to be court transcribers. I remember Davy Jones, who was drafted from my hometown. We both went AIT together. That's what we thought. And then, we weren't exactly court stenographers, but it was a 4-month school with shorthand, Greg shorthand, and military subjects, English, and something else, and typing. Mm-hmm. And you had to have certain qualifications to get the MOS.
What were your first impressions of your arrival there for training?
For training? It was a lot different from basic. I was pretty relaxed. Well, Fort Benjamin Harrison is, I guess it still is, the motto was home of the Army dollar, because the finance school of the Army was there. The Adjutant General School was there. Also, the School of Media was there, and television and radio. Probably every administrative department, school, or most of them was at Ben Harrison. And there were like 11 steno classes. And, in the basic, you wake up in the morning, you fall out, and you got attention. There, you fell out, woke up, went into form. No one really cared. I was class leader, and, we're the steno people, I don't know, they were much laxer with us for some reason. The finance guys, they're a little more military, but it's an old fort. I don't think it's in existence anymore. I think they closed it, but, then you can get into civilian clothes after class. I mean, you go to school. You actually go to school. It's like high school. You have, 3 rotations of shorthand, typing. I had civilian teachers. I had an Air Force. I had Army personnel teach me. I had Air Force personnel teach me. I had civilians teach me. So, and it was like going back to high school. I mean, the English was actually the book I used in, I think, 7th or 8th grade. for grammar. So identical.
Did you feel like you were learning something worthwhile, a skill or a
Well, I learned shorthand, but I mean, how realistic is that when you get out? And it was Greg shorthand. We did a year's worth of Greg shorthand in 4 months. And then we went to military, which has, like medical, it has different shortcuts and so forth. But to get the MOS, you had to do 90, you had to do 90, was it 90 military? Something like 70, I think 70 civilian and 90 military. I wound up doing 100.
And after the training, where did you go?
Oh, well, I had orders for Germany, and then they took them away. Or as the military says, revoke and redirect. So Ed Grimley and I, we were both going to Germany, and we had to hang around for 2 weeks extra. And then you had leave. They gave you leave for 2 weeks, and then they shipped you over. So he was with the 4th Division. We flew over together, as a matter of fact, on the same plane. So he was with the 4th, and I went with the Americal, Davy Jones, who I went to school with, was with the 101st Airborne. So we were all stenographers over there.
So initially, this was you heard that you were going to go to Germany, and then
I had orders for Germany.
Then that changed.
Yeah.
So from there, you learned that you would be
Correct.
going to Vietnam. What was that like?
I wasn't thrilled. I was pretty disappointed. The ironical thing was I turned down a prestigious job in Vietnam, okay, because there were 3 of us interviewed. They usually interviewed the class leader, of which there were sort of 2 of us in my class. I was recognized by the school, and Pete Nyland was recognized by the captain at the barrack, our company, because he just wanted to choose the class leader. And some of these positions I know that I was steno class 11, and I know that number 10 wound up going to SHAPE, which is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe in Belgium. And what happened was I declined. I didn't want to go to Vietnam. And Pete took it. He had enlisted. He took it, and he wound up in Saigon. I corresponded with him a couple of times, and he was going to the office in civilian clothes. I don't know he could have worked for the CIA over there for all I know. He had enjoyed it, and then he even extended to get a 5-month drop, so he didn't have to spend full 36 months. He probably spent about 30. And Bill Warren and we both declined. So that was good, and then I got orders for Germany, and I'm thinking, well, did I make the right choice? And then I got revoked, and so I wasn't really happy. But there's nothing you can do.
So when did you wind up in Vietnam? Where did you begin your service there?
Where did I land? At Cam Ranh Bay, or did I leave from Cam Ranh? I forget. I think I left from Cam Ranh and landed in, I forget, Tan Son Nhut.
And when was
And
that?
then you hang out. I got there, must have been around June. Yeah, June of 70. I was there 70, 71. And then you just have to get processed. So I don't much remember that, but it was a pain because it's hot as hell. Just a touch humid. And you just have to wait because you really don't know where you're going. And then they put you on a plane and to where, the division you're going to. And I didn't know where I'd even be working. And it wound up in the JAG office first. So
And the JAG office was where?
in Chulai, Marical Division. So Lieutenant Calley's favorite division. And I didn't know, but there's slots for everything. So the JAG office had a slot for a stenographer. Actually, I was just a glorified clerk typist there but the slot was there. So the Army says, I got to have a stenographer. So I was it. There were slots at the commanding general had a stenographer. The two assistant division commanders had stenographers. So there were 3 stenographers at headquarters. And the chief of staff had a slot for a stenographer. So there are actually 4. And I went from the JAG office. One of the attorneys was nice enough to get me an interview up there when they had a rotation. And I filled the slot in the chief of staff. And usually you rotated out of that to work for a general, which was much easier, but I never did. So I worked for the two different chiefs of staff for the whole time.
Who were the chiefs of staff?
Colonel Clark was the first one, and Colonel Richardson, who became General Richardson, who became a 4-star general. He was promoted while I was working for him while I was there. Colonel Clark retired out of the Army, and Richardson went on. I don't know. You can Google him. He's got quite a bio, but he went on to head up various commands, and you get 4 stars in your shoulder. You're up there.
What was that experience like? What was it like to be?
Pardon?
What was that experience like for you to be in the presence?
It was a lot of work. I mean, in the JAG office, it was mostly entertainment because it was like a MASH unit because those guys, the attorneys, some of them were drafted and then enlisted, went JAG. Most of them had just go on JAG, which was a 4-year commitment. They're stuck, and they're stuck at captain, which agitated them because doctors could gain rank, and doctors had a 2-year, 3-year, or 4-year deal. Attorneys had a 1-year deal. That's it. You're in. We got you for 4 years. Have a nice life. And they were very funny and humorous guys, and they were very unmilitary. Didn't like the military. They usually didn't even salute you or make you salute them. I found them to be. They all came from, all over the country, all different law schools. They had to be practicing attorneys to get in to be a JAG member, and that was more interesting. My main mission was typing up the reviews of every court-martial, but I did a lot of other typing on legal documents. And how much you want me to go into this? There were actually murders and trials, drug trials. The one particular that stands out was a kid whose father was actually an attorney in Florida, and he was running a pretty good drug cartel, you might say. He was selling, you name it. And his father was highly concerned because he was up for a dishonorable discharge. And Captain Cole, world's greatest attorney in his opinion, defended him. And I did a lot of the correspondence because his dad wrote to this guy, and he wanted his credentials. He wanted to know how long he'd been practicing. He was a very concerned father because if you get a dishonorable discharge, job hunting is, it's a severe handicap. So, short story long, he got it knocked down to a bad conduct discharge, which is a touch under dishonorable. It's not great. You probably don't want to put it on a job application, but it is not a dishonorable. So there was quite a bit of correspondence that went back and forth. They actually flew, I think he flew his father over as a character witness at the trial. And there were actual murders. There were, I used to type up the line of duty determinations, which had to be done when there was a non-combat death for your insurance. If you were in the line of duty or not, the Army would pay or not pay your life insurance. So there were cases, the kid went out of an airplane. Then there was things called congressional inquiries. Well, parents might write their congressman and say, my son fell out of an airplane. Could you investigate that? That also, I would be typing those reports. That went back. So this is pretty important stuff and not to be fooled around with. So I can tell you that a kid was taken in from the field for drugs, and he did go out of a helicopter and fell to his death. Now, I cannot tell you whether he was properly strapped in, got loose, or what, but you could draw the conclusion that somebody wasn't paying attention to him, and an accident that should not have happened. So those are some of the things that I, was privy to. And we actually had murders occur. We actually had soldiers get up and kill other soldiers, first-degree murder. So the Miracal, we had Agent Orange, we had Lieutenant Calley. We were not the Army's, golden boy. Agent Orange was done when I got there.
When you say done, meaning that
we weren't using it anymore. I was very cognizant of that, but we were not hadn't used it in a year or so. And I met Lieutenant Calley's military attorney, Major Raby, because he went to trial when I was there, and they took some depositions. So he was actually brought over. He was actually, there with the division with his attorney. I did not meet him, but I met his attorney.
That was clearly a significant event, situation, experience. What was that like for you dealing with the Calley case?
At that point, I thought it was perfectly justified. Years later, in seeing some stuff on public TV and meeting, which is a gentleman, it wasn't justified. Okay, very extremely controversial. He probably shouldn't have been pardoned. Wasn't the sharpest knife in a drawer. But I think you're at that problem. The problem is you're at that point where you don't really know who the enemy is, which is true. It's the same way in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. So the VC were, farmers by day, soldiers by night. And the NVA, they wore the uniforms. They were the traditional military. They could be defeated. The VC, we never could be defeated. It was a civil war to begin with. We shouldn't have been there. It was a gaggle, just as these are gaggles. And they become political. And we didn't learn from Vietnam.
What was the mood like among the people you were working with, given some of these cases, some of these events? What was the?
I mean, towards Cali?
Well, no, just I guess more towards what were people talking about? What were the conversations? How were people feeling about what was going on?
No one really. No one really liked it. I mean, there were some guys that had enlisted that actually, re-enlisted. There were guys that re-enlisted to stay there. And there are just some people that must like to go out and, camp in the woods and shoot. I'm not one of them. And I don't know what percentage that was. And then you had other guys that enlisted that probably would never re-enlist to go back over there. And then you had the draftees who didn't want to be in there in the first place. And most of them did their jobs. They had a 2-year, commitment, and a year over there, you knew when you were leaving, and everyone counted days to when they were going to leave. So, the Afghanistan and Iraq thing is different because they just keep, you go and you come back and you go and you come back. But there, we knew when we were leaving. If we wanted to extend, we could. But everyone knew when they were leaving, whether you were listed or drafted or whatever. So I never met anybody that really enjoyed it or liked it. It was, hot as hell and humid. And frankly, I don't know how anybody even fought a war over there. It was so hot. I mean, 90% humidity was average, and 90 plus temperature was average. And it took a while to get used to that because you would you'd take a shower and you'd never feel clean. That's the best way I can put it. And when I came home, I never even slept with the air conditioning on for the whole summer. I mean, it was that much of a difference in climate. Now, I don't know how they went out in the jungles and fought a war. Just amazed me.
Now, you were at this point, how old?
I was 20, drafted at about 24. I was about 25.
About 25. So as a 25-year-old, I'm not sure how to frame the question, but what was that like, given the frame of reference you had growing up in Hartford, West Hartford, and now you're
culture shock.
In Vietnam, and you're dealing with these cases and these situations that.
Yeah, well, a little anger. You get over the anger because you meet other people. If you were the only draftee over there, you'd probably go crazy. But as I said, misery loves company, and that psychologically that saved you. And I wasn't no one was shooting at me. We had a large base camp. It was about a 45-minute drive around the entire base camp. We had a Marine Air Group attached to us. We had the USS New Jersey off our shore. We were one of the largest divisions over there. And the only thing I had to worry about were rockets landing here or there, mostly at the airport. No one, at the end of my tour, one came fairly close. But my life was never in danger. I did not have to carry a weapon when I, rode or walked on the base or anything. So it was a different. I had a slightly different perspective. So, I wasn't, thrilled to be there, but no one was shooting at me, and that was the big thing. So, and there's a lot of jobs in the Army. I never knew there were stenographers. I met guys going over to I met a kid who his MOS was meat inspector, food inspector. But for every guy in the field, there's like 10 backing them up in the rear. And I guess that's true. So,
was there such a thing as a typical day for you? It's certainly when you were, when you were with the.
It's just work. You work 10-hour days. When I worked for the chief, I was 12-hour. I was on the job at 6:30, and I left around 6:30 at night. Mm-hmm. I kept his hours, and he stayed in his office all day long, primarily. He ran the division from an administrative, point of view. But day by day he was the guy that ran the division, the chief of staff. So I had to be in the job before he came to the office, and I left after he left. So, I was so damn busy. I had the privilege of working in air conditioning. I ate at the general's mess. I ate their food. I ate in the back. I didn't eat at a table or anything, but I didn't pull any detail. I wore starch fatigues, believe it or not. I had a hooch maid that did my laundry at that point because of my position. And I just, man, I mean, the day was you worked and then you went drinking at night in the club, enlisted man's club, or NCO club, because that was your life. And the JAG office was, I was pretty damn busy there too. So I just, didn't work in air conditioning. I had a fan and, I'd get used to the heat, but there were more people in the JAG office to socialize with. At headquarters, I mean, the generals all traveled during the day. They were in, they were gone. Chief was there, the assistant. Well, until Colonel Richardson got rid of the assistant. There was the head sergeant, there were the stenos. That was it. So I pretty much sat at my desk, literally, okay, and made phone calls, got people served a few coffee now and then, and type all sorts of typing, little shorthand. And, I was his secretary, basically, whatever you want to call me, administrative. It's now called administrative assistant. It's not a stenographer, but, I mean, Richardson used my shorthand. Not a lot, but at the end, I wrote a lot of letters for him when he was promoted. Clark, I never took shorthand from Clark. I took it from one of the generals once, filling in for his steno. But I didn't use my shorthand that much. I used my typing. And the only thing at headquarters was whenever you typed anything, I had an old IBM Selectric. You couldn't make a mistake. There's no such thing as erasing. We had little whiteout things, and that was it. But you couldn't use it. So whenever you typed, if you didn't want to type it 3 times, you had to go very slowly. That was I don't know if it was nerve-wracking, but it was a pain in the butt. And the phone system was not exactly, AT&T. It was tricky. And the chief, corresponded with a lot of people, and military has a lot of protocol. So to get somebody down in Saigon, you had to go through 2 different operators. You just didn't dial direct. And, it could take a while just for the phone call to go through. There's sort of humorous things now as I look back, but it wasn't humorous then because I was calling probably a general and in a command, MACV command or some, and, he says, I want, can you give me General Ursano? Was some guy, he called a lot. I don't know what he did, but he was a popular guy. And, if they couldn't get the connection, the true lie operator, she'd hang up on you. And you'd just throw your arms up. So, I mean, humorous to me now, but it wasn't then because but Richardson was he was a really nice guy. And I enjoyed, working for him. He treated me with respect. I did his whole office for him. It was the first thing I did for him when he took command, decorated his whole office. Worked till like 10 o'clock at night. I had no clue what I was doing. And all I remember thinking, God, I hope he likes what I did. And he came in the next morning, never touched a thing, thanked me very professionally. And I really felt good because I didn't know what to expect. I thought he'd come in and make me come in and redo the whole thing. So his award, guns, God. But he was West Point, and he had a master's from Georgetown, George Washington, I think. But he treated me with a lot more respect than Colonel Clark did. I was just, somebody to Colonel Clark. So.
How did you?
Want to hear my heroin story?
I do. I do.
Just an aside. I don't know, they arrested some kid we had a bad problem with drugs in my division.
Talk about it. When you say your division was? The
Marical. We had a lot of kids using drugs. Well, it was pretty prevalent over there. It got so bad that the command sergeant major of the division, Sergeant Major Barron, who was one of the most fabulous people I ever met, actually put a program into effect, that if you could turn yourself in voluntarily, go under and you would not be court-martialed or prosecuted. You had to do it voluntarily, and you had to undergo treatment. And he was a very big advocate for the soldier. This guy had served in Korea. He was missing 2 fingers on one hand. He had 2 combat infantry badges, which meant he had gone through 2 wars, seeing action. And he had an unbelievable sense of humor. He would go to each hospital. We had 3 of them every night and visit the soldiers, the wounded. In fact, I went with him once, which was the most, the opposite of humiliating, but I can't think of the word. Amazing experience I ever had. And if some kid wanted, cigarettes or something, he'd get them. It was almost like a MASH scenario, because he'd find them. He'd go to the aide, general's aide, and he'd go, hey, I got to get me a pack. Kid wants a packet of Camels, and the CG smell Camels. I got to bring this kid Camels. And Verga, the little captain, would go and get them. And he told me, I'll never forget this, he said, there's only one way to end a day in Vietnam. And he said, you go to the hospitals. And he did that every night. He visited, and I went with him once. And it was, as I said, it just, I don't know how he did it, but it was a highly moving experience. Because we had the 91st Evac 27 Surge and another hospital. In fact, 60 Minutes did a story on the 27th Surgical Hospital, the nurses there. And when you walk in the hospital and you're there, I mean, there are kids lying that aren't going to be there the next day. And you're actually interacting with nurses and other soldiers. It affects you. So it affects you. So that wasn't when I started out. Oh, the heroin story. So we had a serious drug problem, and Captain Washko, who was one of the attorneys, some kid had, I don't know whether he turned himself in or whatever, but he had like 80 pounds of marijuana by his desk and a little tiny vial of heroin. And he pulls it out and he says, do you know what this is? I said, I'm clueless. He said, it's heroin. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, smell it. And I didn't want to even get near it. So he says, oh, come on. And he practically forces it up my nose, laughing, and I didn't like it. And I went to lunch and it revisited me. And I went back and I told him, and then he apologized. He didn't feel, he didn't feel like he should be laughing at me anymore. So that was, he was trying to estimate what that little vial would be worth on the streets. And he said, this would be worth quite a lot of money at home. It couldn't have been bigger than that, pure heroin. And I actually went over, after that happened, I went over to the medical tent unit, and I talked to a doctor, and he said, for God's sakes, don't worry, you're not going to become addicted or anything. But I felt sick really quick, and lunch revisited me. So it's my heroin. But that's, we had some serious, crap going on.
Yeah, you mentioned that there was a real drug problem. Talk about that.
I'm sorry, the what?
You mentioned that there was a real problem with.
Yeah, a lot of kids. I met guys after, in work, in business, my last career, that flew helicopters in Vietnam. And, they said that, getting, drugs was bad. You didn't ever want to fly with somebody who was on drugs. If they'd had a few beers, that's one thing. But they were very afraid of ever going up with somebody who was on drugs and flying, especially in combat. And it was very, opium was over there. It was very prevalent. We just happened to be in the worst scenario. Rank was very slow in the Americal. It was a screwed up division for some reason.
Also,
Well, I had friends that went over there that jumped rank. I got promoted like about a week before I left country. and they sent me my orders. I still have them at home because I left as a E4 specialist 4. My orders hadn't actually arrived back yet. That takes a month or so. So technically I have the orders. Technically I left the Army as Spec 5. I never was able to enjoy that, promotion, because that sort of puts you at a little different level. So you didn't take as much, crap as you did as a E4 or E3 or buck private. So, but the drugs, as I said, drug use was a big problem. And
was this on the base as much?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's why the sergeant major actually got that in. It was, what did he call it? Where you can turn yourself in. I'm old. My brain's not working. Anyway, if you're being investigated or you were using, drugs or selling them, God knows what. As I said, you could turn yourself in and not be prosecuted, but you'd have to go into rehab and get yourself clean and, sign off that this was it. And we had more than one murder. The only reason I know this is because I worked in the JAG office and I typed up the reports that were followed through and actual quotes. I mean, there were kids, in all the court martials. So when typing up, every court martial had to have a review, which the staff judge advocate, Colonel Miller, had to write up and sign off on agreeing or disagreeing with the judge's sentence. Had to be there, okay? And I used to type those, 4 copies, 8.5 by 14, with carbon, manual typewriter, with a fan blowing the paper to hell and in my face. Okay, that was my main mission in the JAG office. So, and I would also help out because they transcribed. There was a kid, his only job was every court martial, he went in with a Sony, an old Sony, or a Kai it was called, tape recorder, reel to reel, put in the headphones, record the entire thing, and then type it from the headphones. That took a long time. And it was one kid in the JAG office. That was the only thing he did. So at times I would help him because we would have a court martial probably every week. We had a rape case. We had first-degree murders. We had aggravated assaults. So I would see all this stuff. No one knew. We had a kid actually leave, guard duty, and he turned to the kid next to him and he said, "I'm going to go frag the XO." He got up and left, took a hand grenade, rolled it, and blew up the lieutenant. Killed him. Came back and said, I'm quoting, okay, I just fragged the XO. That's what I mean by we were, now whether this went on other divisions, I don't know. But I know rank was, for some reason, very slow with the AmeriCal. And we had a lot of legal troubles, I guess. So, plus Cali, we had a fire base that was overrun. Written up in Time magazine, I remember. I had the whole report in my desk that, brigade commander or whatever battalion commander was faulted. Some guys got killed.
Where was that?
I had the report in my desk. Colonel Richardson brought it to me. He actually said it was a secret. It was classified secret. He said, I want you to look this over. I mean, I couldn't have read it in a week. But I remember seeing an article mentioned in Time magazine. But I know that the battalion commander was reprimanded, and it shouldn't have happened. Other than that, I don't, guards weren't posted right, protocol wasn't followed. But that's the field. It wasn't conventional warfare. That was the first time we weren't in conventional warfare. And the NVA, the VC they were the farmers, but they were soldiers at night. They were the guys setting the tripwires, the booby traps. And the other NVA they fought in uniform. They were more they were conventional. And in our division, I remember the chief telling me that 60%, your odds of getting killed were 4 in 10. Odds of getting, your leg blown off or arm was 6 in 10. So your odds are higher to get wounded than actually killed. And that didn't do with anything, but.
Did you have local citizens working on the base at all?
We had the hooch maids, they were called hooch maids, that did laundry and stuff. On Key was the village that we were in. I never went into it. But those were the only civilians, and they were all Vietnamese.
Did you
Yeah,
feel
no American
relatively
civilians.
safe on the base?
Safe, yeah. I didn't want to go off the base. I went to Saigon for a week. I on R&R. Well, I got coming back from R&R. I couldn't get back up country on a flight because we were in Cambodia at that point, and one of our generals went down to head up that command. Actually, so I spent a week extra in Saigon. They actually flew me back up in a VIP flight, and I got nervous. Just he was there, General Metaxas, and I stayed with his steno. I remember going into a Vietnam restaurant. I didn't even want to eat the food. And I was paranoid. I'll admit it. And I drove with his driver. And Saigon was amazing because there are no street signs, nothing. Just imagine 800 people and 700 going one direction and 100 coming the other direction. And everything worked out. And I drove with him. And we went to the guy's driver's house. And Archie, his general steno, you want a beer? I didn't even want a Coke. Archie's drinking, and how paranoid I was. So, but I spent a week in Saigon, and that was, that was something. I was at MACV headquarters, and, you walk the streets at night, and guys are, it's the old joke, you want to watch which one. And, it was all sorts of stuff going on there. So, but those are my memories of Saigon. Short-lived, but.
Do you have? You certainly were with a lot of people. You made friends. I would imagine. Anybody you keep in touch with?
No, I wish there were. I can't. I've even tried to Google at times. Tony Lawaldi, who was this commanding general steno, he had an MFA from Yale, from Detroit, one of the funniest kids I ever met. And he would read comic books all day long. He had nothing to do. I'm there just working my ass off because the general administratively had not much to do. So he was the one that actually sent me my orders when they came back home. Pete Nyland, who took that job, I did correspond with a couple of times. I'd love to know what happened to him. Ed Grimley, who I went over with, I did visit in Rhode Island. He was from Warwick. I don't know where he is now. I did go to visit him, but we lost, me being in Connecticut, him being there, we just lost touch with each other. But yeah, I'd love to, very funny kid. I'd love to see him, but I wouldn't know how to, I guess I could go up. I'm not one for Facebook and Google and see if there's an Ed Grimley in Warwick. I think it was Warwick. And other guys, yeah, you have friends, but they'd come all over the country. So the chief's driver was a really nice kid, Uribe. But I forget where he was from. And and then you go through basic, and then everyone goes a different direction. So Davy Jones was from West Hartford. He was with the 101st. I don't know what happened to him, but he we were good friends in basic. And he was from my hometown and drafted, but I don't know what happened to him. But those are the only ones that come to mind.
What was it like to meet people or to be working with people really from all over the place? Were there any memorable Was there anything that memorable experiences, but also anything that maybe you learned about parts of our country that you didn't really know about?
No, I didn't.
That wasn't really.
The only was I never met anybody from Texas I cared for.
No.
Not in the military. But other than that, everyone pretty much was. If they were drafted, it didn't matter where you were from. I mean, what ethnicity you were, race you were, all in the same boat. The only thing, but at that time, race relations were not great.
Talk about that.
Okay, Black Power was its height, and it was manifested over there as well. I remember there was a lot of guys going around, the African Americans with the black, bead necklaces and this and the salutes. When I landed, coming home at Fort Lewis, in the front of the plane, my most vivid memory is like 4 guys immediately put up a big red banner with a big black arm and fist. The minute we hit the ground. But I did not really notice any real animosity between. I didn't work with any. Okay, outside of basic. JAG office didn't have, it was none in the headquarters either. So I didn't work with any. But that it was not, it was the whole Black Power movement at that time in the 60s, 70s. It was, and it just, moved into the military. It was in all segments of society. But I will never forget when a plane landed. I expected guys was clapping and yay, and that thing went up. And no one was clapping. So.
While you were there, how did you keep in touch with your family or family and friends?
Writing.
Did you write a lot?
Yeah, I think. I don't remember. They had a thing called a Mars call. Mm-hmm. It's not like today, but it was. You had to wait to get a signal, and it was like talking on a walkie-talkie. You had to keep going, hi, over, da-da-da. I happened to be engaged at the time. Not to Carol. So I wrote a lot, that broke up, so.
Yeah. Did you get a sense of what was going on back here in the States?
Not really. I don't remember getting it. No, I don't remember even caring.
Really? Were you able to read newspapers, magazines?
There wasn't much. I don't remember because we didn't have the technology. We didn't have the internet. All that wasn't around. Mm-hmm. And frankly, everyone was really keyed on when you were leaving. Mm-hmm. Guys would keep calendars. Some guys would keep them from the day they got there and check off every day. Some would wait till the last 30 days or the last couple months. And I think everyone just was keyed when they were going to get out of there. I know the attorneys were.
So, did you go to any USO shows, or what did you?
No, I could have, but I could have gone to see Bob Hope. Unfortunately, Bob Hope always just came to the AmeriCal, but the year I was there, he didn't. He went to Da Nang, and I could have gone. But it meant traveling in a deuce-and-a-half truck, not the most comfortable thing, all the way to Da Nang. And I said no. I really wanted to go. I really would have wanted to see him because, especially if he came to Chuai, I'm assuming I would have had a shot at a pretty good seat, being in the position I was in. But I just didn't want to truck. Just didn't want the ride. So what did you do when you did have some time off? What did drink? No, there wasn't much to really. It was mainly the NCO club and enlisted man's club or the officers club. at night because there literally wasn't, I mean, you can't leave the base. There's nowhere to go anyway. And that was it because that was your social life. You drank a lot of beer, and they had bands that would come to the clubs from Korea, wherever, and that's really what you did. I mean, I don't remember. Nobody really read books, or there was no TV to watch. Our band went down the street, weekly on the weekends and played stuff. But no, that was your that and if you had to pull guard or you had to do like guard duty or something. I mean, I had to do that till I got to headquarters, and then didn't have to worry about that. But I mean, I was out the first time I pulled guard duty. These bunkers, I don't know, 15, 20 feet off the ground, 3 guys to a bunker. Every other one or third one with an M60 and grenade. I mean, and the kids, and you're just guarding nothing. I mean, I'm thinking, where are these guys coming from? They're not. And I remember the first time, the 2 guys with me, I mean, I wouldn't have given them a cap pistol. I mean, they were pretty dumb. There's the only way to describe it. One of them made me a little nervous, but that was a pain in the butt. Trying to stay up all night. You did a cot, you couldn't sleep, and every 20 minutes a commo check. And then, and then there's the whole, I get a kick out of this. We were in the sea, truly, but so we had a beach, like a bunkers of the beach. And if you got that location, you're looking out at the ocean and you're going, now where are these enemy sappers, they were called, guys that would come in, sneak in, set off charges, explosives. Were they going to swim? And then I see guys in red shorts and green shirts running on the beach in front of all these bunkers. And I'm thinking, they were Marine pilots. And I'm thinking, what the hell are we doing here? Why am I, why am I wasting my time and spending my night here with very little sleep? Okay, obviously it's not a real dangerous position if I got Marine pilots running up and down a beach in shorts. Anyway. Glad you're laughing.
Was there music that you recall from that time? Did you have radio?
God, I'm trying to remember. I'm sure we must have had radio. The only music I remember are the bands, the rock and. It's funny. We must have had radios. I just don't remember for some reason.
Where were you when your service ended? Talk about the discharge process.
The only thing I remember with the discharge process, and the closest I came to pulling a postal, was going out on a tarmac in a school bus, painted green, in a Class A uniform for a short sleeve, but okay, and having to go through a search on the plane for drugs. They searched you when they were sending you home.
When you were leaving? Okay,
yeah, when I was leaving.
So where did you leave from?
I left from, I think it was Cameron Bay. I left from. There were two big bases where you were either departed or brought in. I think it was Cameron where most people departed. And there's the plane, and they put you on the bus, and it just parks out there. Now, if you can imagine 90 plus humidity and 90 plus degrees on a school bus, okay, it's hot. And you actually they searched you. And, if there was anything you couldn't take with you, if you wanted, you were allowed your uniform. You couldn't take your boots, whatever, your pea jacket, that's about it. And we just sat there. That was the closest I came to pulling a postal, because I would have shot somebody for making us do that. It was just asinine. And then finally off the bus, you get on the plane. But it was a 2-day. It was a couple of days, just paperwork, and then you get to Fort Lewis. And there you are at Fort Lewis. Fortunately, it was June, but still, the temperature distance, you land at night, and you're in short sleeves, and I mean, you're leaving 90 plus. Fort Washington, Seattle is, I don't know, at night in June, 60-ish, you're cold. And that's a straight out process. It took me about 22 hours. They go through everything, every form. You make all your claims. If you've got any medical claims, that's it. You better put them down if you want to, have a shot of anything. And then they give you an entire new uniform to go home in. You trade in your khakis for your dress screens. And you go get a whole new, they measure, you get a whole thing. Waste of taxpayers' money.
And you had not been home since
No.
you left, so you were away for a year and a half?
Yeah, year. Then then they give you money to, I was inducted in New Jersey, but they dumped me in the West Coast, so they gave me money to get me, I guess, I don't remember, back to New Jersey or the East Coast. And I flew United, I remember, to Chicago and then home.
In uniform?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
No one was clearing it. It's entirely different now because when we came home, people were spitting at you. Well, not literally, maybe. No one spit at me, but now the attitude, because these guys, I mean, I have a lot of feeling for these guys that, especially the guys in the Reserve and National Guard who, enlisted thinking they're never going to go to a battle zone, a war zone. And all of a sudden, the guys in their 30s, 40s, family, kids, and they get called to active duty, and they don't know when they're even leaving over there. Okay, and then they could get called back. But when they come home, we don't have a draft now. The attitude is much different because all these guys are volunteers. So in my day, you came home and it wasn't, no one was shaking your hand. The news wasn't there to welcome you back or any of that stuff. You were just glad to, to get home and be a civilian. That was you just wanted to be a civilian. And, I had no job. I didn't know quite, I had a degree. So I had to go find, start my career. And that was, by that time the engagement was broken. So that was my first concern is what am I going to do? Who am I going to go to work for? What do I want? Do I want to go into sales? Do I want to go into this? And I eventually went into retailing and started at Filene's in Boston. But that was what was on my mind. I just wanted to get out of that heat, humidity, and I just wanted to get the hell out of there.
How did you transition back into civilian life? What just the mental process, the emotional process? When did you think that you were
easy.
A civilian again?
Yeah, no, it was easy. I mean, I wasn't going that long, so the world hadn't changed that much. I was like going to prison for 20 years. But no, that part was easy. And I was still living at home then. And the main thing was I really didn't know what, my degree was in business. And, I knew that was where somewhere I was going to go, but it's a big field. I'm going to get a job in retailing, going to get a job in sales. And then if I'm in sales, what field am I going to go, So I had to do a little, some friends of my father talked to me at what to do and give me some advice. And I wound up actually calling Filene's and, saying I'm a veteran, I'm a college graduate. And they interviewed me, the woman a college recruiter, and they hired me. And I went to their executive training program. And, moved up there, got an apartment, and, I spent about 3.5, 4 years in retailing before I went into sales. Mm-hmm. So that was my main concern because I really didn't know what the heck. I like coming out of college now, only the job market was a lot better then. But still, is it this direction, this particular field or that particular field? And that was my main.
Now, where did you go to college and when did you graduate? And was there
Where'd I go to college?
Were there campus?
I graduated from Suffolk University in Boston.
What year?
69. I attended a couple others, but that's where I graduated from.
And was there any kind of campus unrest or discussion?
No, well, yeah, I mean, Suffolk was, at that time, it was one building, mainly known for its law school, which still probably is today. But now they have a campus, they have a school of business that has a name on it. Obviously, somebody gave a few $1 million, because I get alumni stuff, and it's Sawyer School of Business now. So they moved their law school to a separate location, separate building. So there were no dorms. They have dorms now. And, I lived on that Beacon Hill. So at that point, most of the stuff, no one was occupying the dean's office at Suffolk. We weren't that big a school. It was over at BU, BC. But that was going on then. And it was going on before I got drafted, while I was there, a little bit starting to be on the wane after, because the war had pretty much wound down by 71, 72. So we got out of, we were out of there. So.
Did you get involved in any kind of military organizations, veterans organizations after service?
I don't know why. No, I know there's an AmeriCal association. I have been on the internet just trying to find somebody, and there is an AmeriCal website. They do have things, all meetings and stuff. But God, that's so many guys. Geez, I mean, most of it, those guys were fighting, weren't guys in the rear like me. If I thought I, could go meet some people that I, worked with, I would. I wouldn't mind meeting, wonder what happened to the attorneys. Well, they all went back to, law, but they were nice. They were nice. They were very nice guys.
So you haven't really attended reunions, and you haven't found.
No, it's not like college. There's really reunions. The divisions I know have reunions and stuff, but I'm not. My companies, I was in headquarters company. It wasn't that big, so.
Did you? You've had time to reflect on how your service may have affected your life. Do you? No,
I don't think of it. I look back, and it took 19 and a half months of my life, but I don't miss them now. I don't miss them now. I missed them then because my friends, didn't have their lives taken. 19 months, year and a half taken out of their lives, but I don't miss it now. It didn't really matter much in the Hill of Beans, so.
Did it add anything to your life, that experience?
Pardon?
Did that experience add anything to your
Probably not.
Life?
No, it just, taught me that I'm not really into big bureaucracies, like the military, and that I just couldn't, their mentality is such, I just couldn't, ever, make a career out of it. And I'm too an independent person. And I'm not sorry that I, served, but, if I had the choice, obviously, I certainly didn't want to, so.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add to what we've covered thus far in the interview?
I don't know. Probably when you leave, I'll think of 8,000 things. No, I get embarrassed at times when people, you're a Vietnam veteran, they think, well, you're out there shooting a weapon. And I always usually I say I wasn't shooting at anybody and I was shooting at me. And, I look at it sort of an interesting career because I was at a level of the Army that people 20 years may not see. So And I was, as I said, I was privy to a lot of information that people would never know even went on. And, I met some nice people. If I had known that Colonel Richardson went on to become a 4-star general, I might have written him a letter or something. I know he hadn't got his star yet. You make a list. And I don't know when he officially got his first star, but other than that, I really don't have any regret. I regret I got drafted, but all in all, I came out, my arms and legs were attached, my head was screwed on, and I'm thankful for that. And if you look back, I had an interesting career. I learned a lot of how the military, at least the judicial system, works, which is different from ours. And I was at a level of the Army where a lot of people will never see. Did I meet, some idiots and people I didn't like? Yeah. And I met some nice people. And I found out that, both my parents were military people. They met in the military. And my father went on to, go into, he retired a lieutenant colonel out of the reserves. But it just ain't for me. But in his day, the attitude was different. So, and I feel an emotional tie to these guys in Afghanistan and what they're going through. And I really I deeply feel sorry for them, especially the guys, the reservists and National Guard guys, and even the guys that had enlisted. And I see, the problems and the same thing happening. It's a political confrontation. And from the books I've become sort of an avid reader about things. And some of the books I've read just back up what the smart people were saying about Vietnam. It got political. It was political. Militarily, our hands were tied. I mean, we dropped more bombs in Vietnam than we did in Korea, I believe, in World War II combined. And, we were restricted as to what we could do because of collateral damage. I mean, they had the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and if we wanted to shut that off, we could have done it with mustard gas. I had people tell me this, but can't do it. Alan, I got a neighbor up the street who was actually called back, did work for the military intelligence. He was actually called back as a retired state police captain. But, when he was we used to, shoot the breeze, and he said, you can't even, you have to get permission to engage somebody if they're hiding in a mosque over there. You just can't shoot. They can shoot at you. You can't shoot back until you clear and say, as similar stuff, in Vietnam, because you didn't know who the enemy was. And I just see the whole thing as it's just a redo of what we went through over there. And it's, we lost a lot of guys, and worse yet, a lot came back, missing arms and legs. Now it's even worse because, medicine is advanced so they can save more lives. There are more head injuries from what I've read. And, the vets didn't. The sad thing is they never really got their recognition from Vietnam. They're due. The VA is, the benefits. No one's really paid that much attention. It's just now that they've come to the forefront and they're getting help. And that's and they really should, because there's still a lot of vets that, are wounded either mentally, physically, and or both, and homeless from what shows and stuff I see on TV, and it's sad. And it saddens, it's got to sadden you, quote unquote. It's, thinking about that. And that's really the sad thing about war. And especially sad with the Vietnam, because the attitude that was there, and I mean, you know, I mean, we never could bring think of just if somebody had mentioned the word draft today. I mean, I think there'd be riots in the street. I was practically rioting back then in the street, but with Afghanistan, I mean, so fortunately, there isn't a draft, and our friends, you know, kids don't have to go, you know, don't have to look forward to that or have that hanging over their head. And it just, you know, hopefully things will rectify themselves and the veterans will get, you know, they're getting their due and medical help and support and so forth. And look at all the stuff at Walter Reed, and that stuff shouldn't happen. So my advice is stay out of Army hospitals. But not that Walter Reed is, you know, bad, but it's probably pretty good now.
Well, Mr. Mitnick, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be interviewed today, for sharing this with us, and thank you for your service.